The next step is to start generating our property maps, and specifically we're going to generate the random aspect of the property map, the thing that's going to make these characters change randomly as they move around. So let's make a new composition, and we're going to call this random noise comp. And again, this is just 10 seconds long like everything else in here. Open that up, apply new layer to that, as usual, new solid. Okay, and don't need to call that anything particularly. Well, let's give that a new name, actually. Let's call that random noise frame. When we start dealing with compositions that have a lot of layers in them and a lot of complexity, it's actually a good idea to give everything a proper name rather than its default names. That way, when you start to go back and debug it, or you want to change it later on or something like that, you get a little bit clearer idea what's actually going on in there. And the other thing we want to do, now that I think of it, we want to go to the solid settings and actually make this a little bit bigger than the composition itself. And I'll explain why in just a second here. Let's make this, say, 700 by 520, something like that. This layer that we have here is actually now slightly bigger than the composition in which it sits. And the reason being that the next thing we're going to do, need to make sure that's selected. Next thing we're going to do is apply noise to this. Remember the noise that we had before. So we apply our noise. We're going to make this black and white noise. We're going to do the clipping again like we did before so we get the full range. And now we're going to apply to that blur again that we used before. We can use a fast blur this time, actually. A fast blur will work fine. The reasoning behind this is so that the transitions between the letters are maybe not as abrupt as they would be otherwise. The characters, as they're going to be sampling this noise frame here, actually kind of average together a group of pixels underneath them to generate the value that it uses to generate the character. And when those are very different, a lot of times we will get very abrupt changes between the characters. If we do a little blurring like this, we kind of smooth out some of those transitions between the pixels that are being sampled by the property map and make those transitions a little bit smoother. Let's actually scale this down a little bit. Now, the reason that we made our layer a little bit larger than the composition itself is that if we had actually gone and made it the original size, make comp size, let's change that, and we go back in again, you see that at the edges here, this blurs tend to create a little area of darkness at the edge of the layer, which we may end up seeing as an artifact that we don't want in our composition when we finally generate our property map here. So this is just an artifact of the way that blurs work. When you blur right to the edge of a layer and that layer is the same size as the comp, sometimes you'll see this kind of area here where get this kind of darker halo almost. So in fact, that's not what we want to do here. We want to make sure that our layer in our comp is a little bit bigger so that we will then not see that darkness on the edge. We have purely random noise going all the way to the edge of the composition. Okay. So we have one last thing we need to do for this noise map to get it ready for our property map, and that's to apply the levels effect like we did before in the previous chapter. And the purpose of the levels is just to make sure that we're getting the widest range possible of grayscale values here in the noise as it's being generated. So the way you do that is you open up levels here, and this area here, actually let me go back, this area here represents the range of values that are actually present, and by dragging these sliders here, the input black and input white sliders, you're forcing that range of values to spread throughout the entire possible range of grayscale values. And you see that when I do that, that over here we get a much wider range of grayscale values. We get much brighter whites and much darker blacks. And that's just so that we have a wider range of grayscale to apply to the randomness function in our property map once it gets applied to the character, as we're going to be doing a little bit later on. So that's really just the last thing that we needed to do here, was apply this levels, and now we're ready to move on to the next step in terms of creating the property map, which is the elements that are going to actually create the visibility of the text, the illusion of the text falling down. Let's do that next.